Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guests today are Bill Bradshaw and Christina Holzapfel from the Department of Biology. They are co-principal investigators of the Bradshaw-Holzapfel Laboratory and members of the Center for Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Oregon. Bill Bradshaw did his undergraduate work at Princeton. He earned an MS and PhD at the University of Michigan, and he did postdoctoral work at Harvard. In 1986, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship and named a Fulbright Scholar. Christina Holzapfel earned her BA at Goucher College. She earned her MS and PhD at the University of Michigan and did her postgraduate work at Harvard. Bill and Christina have been working together since they met at the University of Michigan. They came to the University of Oregon in 1971. The research of their lab focuses on population biology, evolutionary genetics, and community interaction of insects. Their work has drawn international attention as it has provided scientific evidence that the type of mosquito is changing genetically in response to global warming. It's great to have you here, and I know that you're in great demand these days, so I appreciate your presence here with us today.
Thanks for having us, Steve.
Thanks, Steve, for having us.
On this unusually cool
It's
day
snowing
in the
out.
winter.
We
exactly.
should be talking about
so you're
rapid
totally
climate
wrong,
warming.
and your research today disproves everything you've been saying. So let's begin with a couple of questions about your interest. What made you decide to use mosquitoes in your research? Christina, let's begin with you.
Because we're weird.
Uh-huh.
Because mosquitoes, in this case, happen to provide such an ideal opportunity to look at issues relating to range migration, range changes, seasonality, the development of the clock that runs season, and all of those things move into our climate warming types of studies. We work with the pitcher plant mosquito. We'll show you an illustration of that.
Mm-hmm.
This mosquito has a very broad distribution. It occurs from North Florida into Manitoba. It always occurs in the exact same habitat, the leaf of the purple pitcher plant, and it completes its whole life cycle in the purple pitcher plant.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a geneticist to be able to have an environment that is a constant is extraordinarily important, because you don't have the environment as a variable.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the way from Florida to northern Manitoba, there it is in the same environment. We can pick up that environment, bring it into the lab without creating a novel condition, which is another complication for geneticists, because often the results that you get in a laboratory setting aren't applicable to the field.
Uh-huh.
So we just happen to fall into, by luck, a very fortuitous system
Mm-hmm.
from which we've been able to develop a lot of interesting ideas.
So, Bill, let me ask you the chicken and egg question, or the mosquito global warming question. Which came first, your interest in global warming or the interest in the mutations of this mosquito?
Well, the mosquito really came first.
Uh-huh.
Both Chris and I were fortunate to be introduced to biological clocks as undergraduates. And that's really where we had our first greatest communication, was in this area.
Mm-hmm.
And we're both interested in biogeography. And we had learned about this mosquito, and when we were at Harvard, we went out to a local bog and collected some.
Mm-hmm.
We saw they had a very clean response to day length. Long days, turn them on and they develop. Short days, send them into hibernation.
Mm-hmm.
And then we asked, how does this change with geography? Because the seasons change with geography.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a trip up to northern Nova Scotia and collected them over this climatic gradient. And we saw that the way they responded to day length changed. And they did so in a common environment, a constant uniform environment. So we knew that the changes were genetic. And then we pursued the genetics, population biology, ecology, and evolution of this mosquito.
Mm-hmm.
And 5 years ago, we sat down and said, gee, if our mosquitoes were responding to global warming genetically, how would they do it? And we went and mined some of our own data, and lo and behold, there it was,
Mm-hmm.
that we had reared them many years apart under identical conditions, and we were able to see the genetic signature of global warming.
Mm-hmm. So what were your, Chris, if you want to answer this question, What were you predisposed to find, as it were, when you got involved in this? What were your hunches, and what were the surprises that you found in the research?
So many I can hardly know where to start. Let's try to stick with the surprises relating to global rapid climate change. The first surprise, and I think one of the major contributions that our research has made to this area, was that we have been able to put together the fact that in rapid climate change, number one, it is the winters, not the summers, that are warming. When I ask you, Steve, what do you think rapid climate warming is about? You may not answer this, but 9 people out of 10 would say it's about, gosh, I'm so much hotter in the summer than I have been. In truth, it's about winter warming. So winter warming is driving season length. We're having longer growing seasons. Now the longer growing seasons are allowing organisms of pretty much all types to develop earlier, to make whoopee, have babies, prepare for diapause, go into dormancy, and the fact that this is genetic, and we have shown that it's genetic. That story was very surprising and has been pretty startling to the general community.
Yeah.
The second element of our work that has been surprising to us and now others is that we have actually run experiments in which we have said, okay, in rapid climate warming, everybody talks about temperature. That's all they talk about. Gosh, it's so much hotter. So is it really temperature that's important to the biological organisms? So we ran a huge experiment in which we pitted temperature against the cue that we actually know most temperate organisms use to tell them that it's time to do important long-range things, and that is number of hours of light per day, day length. So we pitted temperature against day length, and we expected temperature to be what was going to be important in the survival of organisms. In fact, with about 180 degrees of global warming temperature difference, the animals didn't really care. They did fine. If we gave them the wrong day lengths, they all croaked.
So I didn't realize that the warming of the winters actually meant that the days were getting longer.
No, they aren't. The days are staying
But the amount of light is
No.
No, what is happening, the season is getting longer.
I see what you mean.
The winter warming
I see.
is driving longer growing seasons, and it's doing that because the winter is warmer. So therefore, you get into fall later and your spring is coming earlier. And so what is that doing? It's giving us a longer growing season.
I see.
Animals are responding to that clearly from our experiment that I just described, not by genetically evolving as relates to the temperature. They're relating to the fact that they're seeing a different day length, a more southern day length, one that corresponds to a longer growing season. And that has been totally startling, first to us and now to the general community.
Yeah, but what about the whole issue of the rapid genetic change? I mean, when people think of evolution, they usually think that these genetic changes, or at least in my naive understanding, would take a much longer time.
I'd say this is the second surprise, that when we went back and we looked in time, that we'd looked at the response to day length from Florida to northern Maine 4 times in 30 years. And when we went back in a 25-year window, we saw the signature of global warming when organisms were grown in a uniform environment, indicating that the shifts we saw were genetic. But then we had another technique that we used and ran the same experiment, and we picked up the signature of global warming over a 5-year period. So these animals are responding extremely rapidly to global warming. But I'd like to add a cautionary note. That's not true of things like polar bears, because their population size is smaller, they have a longer generation time, and it takes them longer to mature. And all of these factors combined led us to predict that small animals, maybe ones we would rather not do very well, like mosquitoes, are going to be able to track global warming in larger animals with longer generation times and smaller populations may not.
And now that we've presented our genetic studies, a number of other people, a few other people, these are kind of hard studies to come up with because they are decadal studies. They take a long time to get the data together for. They aren't things that happen like over a few months or even a year. But genetic changes have now been shown also in birds and mammals as well as insects. So this is seen to be a broad response to rapid climate warming, not something that's just limited to insects, but is also now seen in birds and mammals as well.
So I guess the question is now, do you understand what is causing it? What is causing the global change? Is that something that's within your purview? I know you're doing the experiments. But
this is an important question because the causes are what is so broadly debated. What is the role of people in this? The general assumption is that we're causing all of the rapid climate warming, and we have an illustration that makes very clear. I think there are very few reasonable people that say that climate warming is not occurring right now. However, rapid climate swings such as we are seeing now have occurred many, many times in the past, and we know this from cores done in the ice cores done in the Antarctic region and ice cores done in Greenland. We know that very rapid climate swings have occurred in the past. Scientists don't talk about it, and I'm not exactly sure why not, because that allows non-scientists to say, well, you guys aren't telling us the whole story. In the Younger Dryas, which is a very famous climate swing which occurred about 13,000 years ago. In that particular period, there was, at the end of that period, a climate change of, in just 20 years, 10 degrees, of 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a very...
In 20 years?
Yes, and a very dramatic change
and did
in temperature.
And then did it reverse, or what's it happen?
First, well, remember we're in the Holocene, which is a period of general warming. There was a little mini ice age called the Younger Dryas, which was a very rapid cooling period followed by a rapid warming period. But there have been many examples of this, not just the Younger Dryas. It's happened again and again. So there are clearly cyclical periods of rapid climate change that are caused by things like slight changes in the orbit of the Earth about the sun, sunspots, things that people outside of our area can discuss with you in more detail. But there are various causes of these regular events that occur. People clearly have something to do with the current rapid climate change because, as we were discussing this morning, each one of us in the United States produces about 6 tons, 12,000 pounds of carbon per year. And you can actually get on a Environmental Protection Agency website and calculate the amount of carbon that you are producing to add to global climate change right now as we speak. So,
and am I producing more than my fellow Earth inhabitor in some other place?
Did you drive here or did you walk here?
I walked here.
Good
I
for
walked
you.
here. But I guess if I were living in another part of the world, it would have been almost inconceivable that I would have driven here.
The United States produces way more carbon and greenhouse gases than the rest of the world does.
Although I hear that Europe is now
they're working on it. I mean, and you know, then there are third world countries that are coming along. But we have already, when you look at an historical picture of climate change, the world now is about as warm as it has been in the last 500,000 years.
That's extraordinary.
We have about as much carbon now in the atmosphere as we have in the last 500,000 years.
Well, I'm surprised we don't have more, but...
Well, that's one of the questions is, if you look at the signature of carbon in the atmosphere and you calculate how many tons, kilotons per year we're putting out, that isn't all going into the atmosphere. Some of it is
I see.
being absorbed somewhere on the planet. And
Uh-huh.
one of the questions I think particularly oceanographers are interested in is,
Mm-hmm.
do the oceans provide a carbon sink?
Mm-hmm.
But the amount of carbon the sink is not absorbing at all. It is increasing.
So, how different is your research and from other people's research, and how many people are working on this very crucial issue at the moment?
There are a number of people that are working on this from different points of view. There aren't a lot of people that have the long-term historical data that we do because we're not 25 years old. We have been collecting this data
Yeah.
for a long time.
And you've had this relationship with these mosquitoes for a while now.
Yeah,
About 30 years.
Yeah.
It's interesting. First of all, people noticed that animals were were expanding their ranges northwards, or they were doing things, mating and making whoopee earlier in the year. And this was kind of the biological response to global warming. The people who did this were people who had had an intimate relationship with these animals, because 30 years ago, you didn't write a proposal on, I want money to study global warming. It was a non-issue. So it was only people who'd been watching a bird population for other basic research questions and not at all applied, who had the, as you said, long-term intimate knowledge with these organisms to say, yes, we haven't seen them. I mean, particularly in Britain, where you have all these avid naturalists, they know the first day they see that Tweety bird or that butterfly comes out. And they write these things down. And so the biological response to global warming was there. And it's now widespread. It's no longer news that animals are spreading their ranges northwards or going up the mountain.
But those are phenotypic descriptions. And phenotypic descriptions are by definition based on the individual.
You want to, for our audience here, you want to explain phenotypic.
Okay, a phenotypic versus genetic. A phenotypic description is more like the way I look, rather than what my genes are inside of me. And so a phenotypic type of response is something that scientists say, well, that can be reversed when climate change reverses, because you know it's going to reverse again. All of those little organisms will just be able to reverse that.
But when the genetic thing
But
changes.
once climate change has penetrated to the level of the gene, it even makes politicians worried. They don't like their genetic.
Maybe we'll have better politicians in the future.
There you go. But it is a different level when climate change is actually showing up at the genetic level. So,
well, let me ask you the $64,000 question then. Given this seems extremely persuasive data that you've come up with and that others have come up with, are humans, what's the chance for humans now, at this moment? Is it too late to reverse it, and what part of it is in a sense, in an evolutionary sense, reversible? That is not kind of going against the whole evolutionary development of the planet. I mean, who knows? Maybe the mosquito was
meant to be in charge
of the planet. So the first question is it too late? Because these things obviously are happening very quickly already. As you say, there have been genetic changes which are not reversible. What is your gut feeling about it?
One, I didn't say that genetic changes aren't reversible.
I see.
That is one area that has not been clearly researched. And another area that has not been well researched is, can the rate of evolution of organisms, that is genetic change, adaptation, keep up with the rate of climate change?
Yes.
Two very important questions.
Right.
Some organisms will be able to, some won't.
But you've been suggesting that the small animals are better off, and I guess we're not elephants, but we're not. Are we small animals?
No, but we have a very unique way of changing our environment.
So tell me about that. I mean, what is your prognostication for humans in all this?
My prognostication from the importance of humans are, why should the person on the street care? And two basic reasons that I see. One is economic. and that the United States has always been blessed with an abundance of food, and that ultimately we produce more food than we use. And this puts us in a very good economic situation globally. Other people will have to come to us for food. But let us assume with climate warming that the corn belt and the wheat belt moves 200 miles north.
We're in Canada.
We're in Canada. Now Canada becomes the major agricultural producing country in the world, and we have the climate of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
That is going to have very adverse economic consequences.
Right.
Second of all, when the growing season gets longer, it makes it easier for vectors of disease for livestock and humans to transmit those diseases. So we can look forward to having a lot of tropical diseases be the normal way of life in our country. We had a graduate student who went and did his postdoc in Kenya, and the first thing he learned in Kenya, in the rural areas, is 100% of the population has malaria by the time they're 6 weeks old.
And already in this country, dengue fever and yellow fever have both moved into Texas. So these things are already occurring. And yes, your actual question to us, we'll get back to that. Is it too late? And the answer to that is, I think we haven't really discussed this question, but to me the answer is no, it's not too late. There's plenty of things we can do.
Is there plenty of time to do it?
If we get off our high horses and get on with moving forward, yes. And in fact, there is a grassroots movement, as you are well aware.
Right.
Mayors of various towns, for goodness sakes, even Arnold Schwarzenegger is in on this, trying to say, let us roll back our carbon emissions to the standards or the levels that occurred in 1990. So if we aren't going to necessarily have top-down work towards curbing our appetites for electricity, which is the greatest producer of greenhouse gases, and secondarily transportation issues. The lower governments, from the local to the municipal to state governments, are going to do it, and they are doing it. So we're very hopeful.
But why shouldn't it go from the top down as well? I mean, if people begin to understand this as they do now as a real issue, that's why I asked you a question of is there enough time, because I think there is some feeling that time has already run out. And I think to get the message out, if you're persuasive with this, is that no, it's not too late. I think there's a sort of an apocalyptic feeling now, especially among those who are concerned about the environment, that it really is almost too late, or if not, way past too late to do anything about the situation. I think if you really feel strongly that it isn't, it seems to me that there's a lot of education that needs to be done in that regard.
Well, we don't model climate, but I'm thinking we're more hopeful in that. We feel that let's assume it isn't too late and go for it.
Yeah.
The worst that we're going to do is fail.
I like to think of this kind of like a flu pandemic. So there's a flu pandemic that's coming. What do? Just sit here and say, bring in that air with all those flu bugs in it and let me breathe it in. No. The drug companies get geared up and start making vaccines, and we protect ourselves. Somehow we've managed to protect ourselves against those major pandemics. This is just another type of pandemic from my point of view.
But those didn't have all the economic apparatus around the way of life that we're all so used to. So there seems to me to have to be a kind of a sea change in people's attitudes.
I don't know what percent the sociologists can tell you. It's something surprisingly small percent of your population has to become dysfunctional before social fabric begins to unwind.
Let me ask you, just to change the topic just a bit, your research, because you were involved both graduate students and undergraduates, and I understand you wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge some of the people that have been helping you with your research.
Well, what we do want to make clear is that no research at any university goes forward successfully without, one, a great university, two, without great support from the federal government and other agencies. The U of O has set us up incredibly well.
We could not do the research we're doing if they had not set us up with the controlled environment rooms we have.
And really, there aren't any others quite like it in the world.
And our public out there who watches this show, I think, needs to hear that. That's quite a blessing.
Yes.
It is indeed. The Guggenheim and Fulbright Foundations have been very generous. The National Science Foundation has been very generous. Our colleagues are incredible, and our students are unbelievable. And one of the reasons that we put so much emphasis on our students is that about 15 years ago, it occurred to Bill and me that it's really expensive to have a graduate student and train them. It costs a lot of money. And many graduate students come and find that they don't want to be graduate students. So we therefore also train large numbers of undergraduate students in research in our lab. We feel that that is the time to discover, do you really want this solitary, somewhat geeky business of science as the thing that you do for your life?
If you do, great, we'll help you do it, and if you don't, you have our blessing.
So I think again, the public out there, I think this is something that they need to hear, because I think when people think research institution, what does that have to do with undergraduate education? Here, the two of you are actually educating and actually making use of undergraduates in your research.
We have 20 undergraduates working in our lab right now.
And how many graduate students?
4.
4. So in a sense, it's the undergraduates that are carrying
but think what that does for the graduate students as well. They have the opportunity to mentor the undergraduates. So that helps the graduate students to say, is this something I really want to do? Do I want to spend my life teaching and doing research and mentoring people like these undergraduates that I'm working with? So we have tiers of people working in our lab. Bill and I are in the business of writing manuscripts, pushing pencils, doing interviews, talking about the research, designing experiments, analyzing data, that sort of thing. We don't get the wonderful chances to go out into the field that we used to. We send our undergraduates to do that and our graduate students.
I think we get an advanced undergraduate. We have on Fridays what we call the principals meeting. It's where we can talk about money and personnel. And it's not unusual to have an undergraduate involved, and we have actually hired research assistants for undergraduates.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. That's a very important message to send, and your work is extraordinarily important. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Steve, for
so
having
much
us.
for having us.
We've been speaking with Chris Holzapfel and Bill Bradshaw, the co-investigators in their lab in the Center for Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Oregon. Thank you for watching.